Today we're going to have a review of the movie Knock Knock. Normally I don't commentate on movies I watch under the assumption that they won't be, good. There's a time, a place, and a value to bad movies. In my opinion, there is such a thing as a perfectly bad movie. A movie that is so thoroughly produced in the essence of things poorly executed that it actually transcends and becomes phenomenal. AKA how I originally felt about the movie Rubber, which I have to rewatch now that it's been over a decade. I'd be happy to make a video someday going over some of the movies that I think are perfectly bad and how they achieve that, but for today, let's just stick with Knock Knock. If you are unfamiliar with Knock Knock, it's a movie starring Keanu Reeves, in which a married man cheats on his wife while she's away with their children, but surprise, surprise, the two hot, horny women that magically showed up on his doorstep have an agenda far more sinister than the threesome. I didn't go into Knock Knock expecting anything spectacular. I went into it expecting memes, which I think a lot of us do when picking up a modern Keanu Reeves movie not produced with the intent of being a cultural action phenomena. I mean, just look at Replicas. Ever heard of that one? I bet not. And in being just a good, bad movie would have been perfectly acceptable. But the reason we're talking about Knock Knock is because it erred into trying to do something more, and in turn disrespected the source material that it was inspired by. Knock Knock's premise is dead simple. Keanu is manipulated, quotation marks, into cheating on his wife by two seemingly very well educated and liberated young women, only to find that it was a sick game of theirs to gain leverage over him. The young women get enjoyment out of seeing him struggle as they threaten to cross the line into irreparably ruining his life with this scandal. That, in and of itself, is a perfectly compelling story, where whether you agree with Keanu's choices, you are at least sympathetic that the punishment doesn't quite fit the crime. Specifically, when things escalate to them ruining his wife's life's work as an artist, and destroying his prized records, and killing a man, but we'll get into that later. Adultery is one thing, but destruction of livelihoods outside of that act is another. And then, of course, the punishment escalating to the threat of death obviously isn't even in the same ballpark. In and of itself, this sort of mind game could have been fun. A third of the way through the movie, I was going to drop the score for the amount of absolutely obnoxious overacting on behalf of the manipulative woman, but that could have been overlooked. For all I know, they were told to act like that very specifically by the director and didn't have a choice. I can't blame them. They were convincingly obnoxious. Unfortunately, the movie overdid itself not just in the fake acting characters, but ultimately their motives. Some parts became chaos to the point where the more rational manipulations happening that would have been engaging to see play out couldn't hold up to the insanity in between them anymore. Where the movie entirely fell apart was the ending. Spoiler alert. After absolutely destroying Keanu's house, making him believe that they were going to kill him, and posting a video on his social media showing him in a presumed paid kink porn cheating on his wife, which he had cheated on his wife, but in this instance they were now manipulating and sexually harassing/kidnapping him, they leave. They just leave. Keanu is buried in the backyard up to his head with his phone in front of him so he can do nothing but watch his life fall apart and for his wife to come home and discover him like this, which is admittedly a little funny, but the severity of what happens pulled away the consequence of it. Clearly, after this whole situation is played out, after all of the initial impressions of Keanu's wife and his social circle finding out about this, there's very little fault that would be left on him. Who would look at Keanu's punishment and say he deserved any of that? Clearly, he'd been targeted. They hadn't even exposed him for the actual act of adultery that he did. They just propped one up and showed that to people. He could claim innocence. Clearly, he didn't destroy his own house, stab himself, post the kink video, or bury himself in the backyard up to his head because it's literally impossible. These villainesses walking out of the scene they made did nothing but exempt Keanu of his crimes because he so clearly became the victim. Manipulated, assaulted, kidnapped, property vandalized, and he's traumatized. Oh, and did I mention that they murdered someone in front of him? We'll get to that, but overall, it might be embarrassing to call and explain to the cops everything that happened, but the entire mantra of punishing Keanu for his act of adultery doesn't hold up in the end. Plus, they left their fingerprints everywhere. There's so much evidence, I don't know how they think they've punished Keanu more than they've put a target on their own backs. And this matter of punishment to crime and severity gets entirely out of whack when, although they let Keanu live after however many rounds of torment, they killed his family friend slash wife's work partner. They literally killed him, wrapped him in paper mache for fun, threw him in the back of a van, and then they casually mentioned that their guy would have a fun time cleaning up after this one, which gave the impression that they were competent and did this as an ongoing hobby. But even if their guy disposed of that body never to be seen again, there was no cleanup. They left the scene of the crime and everything else in Keanu's house there littered with incriminating evidence. What was the point of alluding to these femme fatales as sadistic masterminds if the movie never actually intended to follow through? And that's where Funny Games comes in. If you haven't watched Funny Games, I highly recommend it. It's a slow burn psychological thriller about two young rich boys that descend upon a family's vacation home with the intent to torture them for their own sadistic pleasure. The similarities between Funny Games and Knock Knock are obvious. Two young, rich, entitled young adults engaging in manipulative mind games intent on destroying a family. And that, let's make a chart. Similarities between Funny Games and Knock Knock: they both have repetitive hobby, young, rich, manipulative antagonists. They isolate and traumatize their targets, specifically on a family basis. But the differences between the two: Funny Games, their intentions are not clear. They are purely sadistic. They do not profess that they intend to murder, although they do, and they leave the scene without evidence. Whereas in Knock Knock, they present themselves with a moral intent. They are on an agenda, which is against adultery. They repeatedly imply that they are going to murder Keanu, but then don't, and then they leave evidence everywhere. So honestly, entirely taking out the acting and directing of these two movies, I think what ruined Knock Knock can be found in the subtle differences in our differences list. As similarly characterized antagonist duos, it came down to a matter of presenting intent and overall outcome. In Funny Games, the antagonists are scary because they're chaotic neutral. They don't care about the outcome so much as the game, so nothing they do turns into a contradiction. We don't have a reference point from which to judge or expect how things will turn out. Whereas in Knock Knock, because the girls are lawful evil and are set up through exposition to have a drive and intent toward a specific outcome, the illusion of them as a dreadful antagonist becomes an obnoxious caricature of what the film was really aiming for when their actions don't follow the logical path to achieve that. There's a lot of oversight that turns what could have been a simple premise with high tension into an eye-roll drama thriller that can't even properly be labeled a parody, because then it would be parodying Funny Games and not doing anything to actually criticize it because they overshot their own insertion of a moral agenda. Even if Knock Knock was intended to be a general parody of the convoluted, twisted portrayal of sadistic antagonists, it's not really good enough to hold itself up to that, and I'm just giving that benefit of the doubt. None of the movie sites mention it as a parody, it's just a drama thriller, which is hard to believe for how ridiculous it is. But anyway, that's just my take. Please go watch Funny Games, it's amazing, and I'd recommend hard skipping Knock Knock, although the scene with Keanu Reeves just yelling at them extremely angry while tied to a chair is pretty funny. As always, I'd like to thank you so much for watching, and special thanks to my patrons